I'm now going to square up the cross-cut sled so it's perpendicular to the table saw blade. The only tool I really need for this is a 24-inch framing square. We may have another tool for you, but it'll be up here on the side with the table saw blades. In this case, I'm using a fine-tooth cross-cut blade. It's a full-width blade. The first thing we're going to do is turn off the saw, raise the blade all the way up, and remove the riving knife. Now that the blade is all the way up, I'm going to take the framing square. I'm going to unlock the fence first. I'm going to take the framing square, press it firmly against the back of the fence, and then I'm going to rest this side of the framing square along the body of the blade. I'm going to be careful not to touch a tooth on either the front or the back. So again, I'm going to keep the framing square, press firmly up against this. I'm going to slide it over until this leading edge is along the body of the blade, not on a tooth. And make sure this is loose. So now I've double checked. The square is not touching either the front or the back. And I'm going to move the fence as needed to get it to line up nice and perpendicular along the edge here. So it happens to be pretty close, so I'll go ahead and just move it out of square so I can show you that process. All I'm going to do is keep the framing square pressed against the fence and move it until it rests flush along the blade. Once you think you have it pretty well set up, which in this case is probably a small gap in the back, I'm going to press lightly down just so as I tighten it, it won't move. You don't need to tighten this a whole lot, like you don't need to use both hands to really get it tight. Just give it a nice snug, it'll be good enough. Don't over tighten this. I'm then going to press again up firmly, and I can inspect it with a scrap of paper if you can't quite visually see. In this case, you can see the paper slips in here pretty easy, so there is a gap in the back. If you keep the fence up close to the part that you're squaring it's better. Don't have it way back here, it introduces a little more air. So I'm going to keep this lined up fairly close in the corner. In this case, I'm still thinking it's probably a little bit looser on the back, but we'll measure it afterwards and find out. Now what we're going to do is take a piece of scrap material. You want the scrap material to have one good clean edge when you're going to cross cut it, so along the length of it here. This is a pretty nice edge. I'm going to mark it in this case so I can keep track of it. This edge is always going to reference against the fence. I'm going to cut this end, and then I'm going to flip the workpiece over. I'm going to cut the opposite end. So to exaggerate the issue, if the fence were out of square a little bit and I were to run it through, it would cut a taper this way. And then when I flip it, keeping the same edge against the fence, it will cut the same taper in this way. And then when I go to the height gauge and I measure the height, this end should be taller and this end should be narrower, which would tell me I have to then bring the fence up a little bit to square. You do want to use a longer piece of wood. This is an 8-inch piece of stock. If you have a narrow piece of material like this, you don't have enough length to measure off of and you won't get a very large difference. So 8-inch piece of stock is probably preferred. You also want to make sure the stock is nice and square or flat. So this piece here has a twist, and then as I make my cut, I'm going to introduce air from that twist that's not necessarily due to the perpendicularity. So now I'm ready to make my cut. I'm just going to graze the blade along the end, flip it, and cut it again. I'm now going to take this piece of stock over to the height gauge and we'll measure it. Alright, we're over here at the height gauge. The first thing I did when I come over here was make sure there's no burrs or anything on these sides. There's a little bit of burrs on this side, but none of them are protruding upwards. The next thing is you want to make sure you have a nice consistent cut. So I set it on the granite plate. If I push down the end, it doesn't weeble wobble in any directions. If it wiggles a little bit when you set it down. That means the cut wasn't very consistent. Typically that happens because the stock shifted to the side as you were cutting, and then it leads to this being tapered that way, and usually that's not a consistent taper. So if it's tapered from the fence, it should be nice and flat all the way along the bottom here. I'm not going to line this up under the height gauge. I'm going to make sure the entire foot of the height gauge is within the stock and not on the edge, so I don't catch any burrs that way. And I'm going to bring it down. I could zero it on the surface of the stock. In this case, I'm just leaving it where it's at. So it's 9.587. We'll take a second reading over here to see what we get. 9.585, so somewhere around 9.58. You can see it's 9.57. So I'm off by 18 or so thousandths. Again, this is double the air, so it's off by about 9 or so thousandths. That's probably acceptable. I've had as little as 1 thousandths. I've hit 5 to 7 thousandths several times, and then I seem to have a gift for getting it in like 25 thousandths range. I would say I would redo it for any critical part if it's over probably 15 thousandths. 15 thousandths is a 64th of an inch, and in most cases you should be able to reach that.